I kept the best part for last. The third and last subconscious influencer of human behavior is its context, or environment if you wish. Its influence has been proven over and over again. The mountain of studies that proves the effect of how our environment influences us is ever growing. It goes from the impact of noise, even small background noise, as a source of stress over things like smell, amount of daylight, ergonomics of all kinds regarding our chair, our mouse, the position of our screen, and so on. But also the visual impact of our surroundings, with sometimes subtle visual clues influencing us. For example, there was this study where we saw employees behaving more egoistically when there were dollar signs in the room than when there weren't. As fascinating as these all may be, and as proven as their effect might have been, I won't talk about them here. I would if this course was about interior design and its impact on employee behavior, but it's not. You see, there is one contextual element that is by far the strongest one in terms of influencing behavior, and that is the social element. Yes, our social environment, with that I mean the people around us, is by far the most determining element when it comes to behavior and behavioral change. There's an important element I haven't shared with you yet, about how we function as social beings. Remember how I explained how we evolved over millions of years, and our social integration mechanism, also called mimetism, ended up embedded in how we function as social beings? Well, turns out it goes even further than we thought. One of the most exciting new discoveries in the field of neuroscience of the last few years was the discovery of mirror neurons. These mirror neurons are located in several brain areas, of which several control movements from grasping to reaching to moving our eyes, and this is what's so special about them. It's as if I see my own body moving, reflected by a mirror, hence the name mirror neurons. Yes, you heard that right. When we see others doing something, our brain is experiencing that same action. Ever seen someone moving their lips while they watch someone else speak? Or someone watching a boxing fight and moving like the boxers do? Or when you watch one of those silly YouTube videos where people fall, ever mimicked pain? All of those examples are our mirror neurons in action. Okay, so what does it mean? Mirror neurons have huge implications. First of all is the fact that we learn by observing others. We knew that before through the work of Bandura with his Bobo doll experiments, but now it is proven through neuroscience as well. Learning by observing has a very important consequence, and that is to lead by example. Yes, we as leaders do not only have the moral obligation to act consciously and give an example to our teams, it is a pedagogical one too. In other words, whatever we do, however we behave, our team will start doing the same. Act as a jerk and they will too. Raise up to the occasion and they will too. We do not only have to tell our people what to do, we have to show it to them as well. We have to be an example, always. Second implication of this is that it's only a matter of time before new members adapt to their new social settings and start acting like anybody else. We will discuss the pitfalls of conformity later in this section as well. Last but not least, mirror neurons make us connect emotionally with others. When I see smiling faces around me, the mirror neurons for smiling fire up in my own brain, and I immediately feel what others feel. Emotions become a group experience. When one person is treated bad, the whole team is sharing his or her pain. When a company restructures, managers only look at numbers and start firing people without taking into account this group experience and its consequences. The disappointment, sadness and fear of one fired person dissolves into the group, affecting all its members long after that one person is gone. So here we are, the importance of context, the importance of every single person in the team, the importance of our role as a leader. In this section I will show you studies, theories and experiments that will put this importance of social context each time under a new light. I will show you how our role as leaders is crucial to the success of our team. The Hawthorne experiments. It probably all started here, in the 1920s, with these Hawthorne experiments. They marked a huge change in thinking about work and productivity. Previous studies had focused on the individual and on ways in which an individual's performance could be improved. Hawthorne set the individual in a social context, establishing that the performance of employees is influenced by their surroundings and by the people that they are working with as much as by their own innate abilities. The experiments took place at Western Electric's factory at Hawthorne, a suburb of Chicago, in the late 1920s and early 1930s. They were conducted for the most part under the supervision of Elton Mayo, who would later become a professor at Harvard. What started as a shameless manipulation of lighting to try to boost productivity led to contradictory results that simply made no sense. First there was a productivity boost, then it faded, then the boost came back when the settings were set back at how they were initially. After scratching their heads over it, the researchers started noticing patterns that had nothing to do with the physical environment, but with psychological and social factors. The employees' working conditions were changed in other ways too, like working hours, rest breaks and so on, and in all cases their productivity improved when a change was made. By the time everything had been returned to the way it was before the changes had begun, productivity at the factory was at its highest level. Absenteeism had plummeted, and it turned out, well, people were working better when they were receiving attention, and once the attention ceased, they reverted to their normal behavior. This phenomenon was called the Hawthorne effect. Now, further experiments revealed the importance of social factors on motivation. A crucial element in Mayo's findings was the effect that working in groups had on the individual. At one time he wrote, "The desire to stand well with one's fellows easily outweighs the merely individual interests and the logic of reasoning upon which so many spurious principles of management are based." Later he added to that, "The working group as a whole actually determined the output of individual workers by reference to a standard that represented the group conception, rather than management's, of a fair day's work. This standard was rarely, if ever, in accord with the standards of the efficiency engineers." There was a whole series of Hawthorne experiments over a period of several years. So what does it all mean? What can we conclude from them, and how to apply that to our teams? Well, first of all, we should stop treating our teams as a sum of individuals and also start thinking about them as being part of a social context. That social context includes informal networks which aren't reflected in the formal hierarchy, and perceived performance standards accepted by the group, which rarely coincide with those of management. Employees will perform better when they truly believe that management is genuinely interested in them. Concretely, here are some recommendations. Treat employees with respect and dignity. Focus on a good communication between you and your team. Be generous with your attention towards team members. Let them participate in decision-making affecting their interests. Let team members express their views, show interest in their opinions. Now, only good physical working conditions aren't enough to impact productivity. Even financial incentives alone will not impact performance. Social and psychological needs must also be satisfied in order to increase productivity. It's interesting to see that what started as a study on the physical environment of employees ended up in one on their social context. It was groundbreaking back in its days, and still today not half as much applied in the field as it should be. So we are contextual, social animals. We behave differently in groups than we do as individuals. Our team members behave differently together than separately. Now this doesn't always lead to the famous 1 + 1 = 3. Sometimes 1 + many still equals 1. Ever heard about the lemmings urban myth, where they follow each other and all run off a cliff if the first one does so? Yeah, well, this is something like that. In 1951, the conformity experiments led by Solomon Asch demonstrated how participants were likely to conform to blatant wrong answers if they were first given by other participants.
The experiment you'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2,
2,
2,
2,
2, 3,
3,
3,
3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2,
2, 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1.
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1.
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me.
1.
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1.
1.
1.
2.
1. 2.
2. 2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2.
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
Over a third of the subjects conformed to the wrong answer. Now, of course, there were several variables that impacted the results. But still, in the end, the conclusion to this classical social experiment is that people are willing to go great lengths to fit in. Remember all I explained before about the Paleolympic brain and our group positioning, about herding and how we evolved into social beings, how living in a group gave us an evolutionary advantage. Remember the physical pain due to social exclusion. Remember oxytocin. Remember the mirror neurons. If people conform up to 30% when faced with blatant wrong facts, we can only start to imagine how high that number becomes when things are not black and white. Now, of course, you're probably thinking you would never do that, conform under peer pressure. Yeah, sure. And you've never laughed about a joke you didn't get either, right? Or just started laughing because others did? So let's face it, we are social animals, and we've all conformed to situations even when we didn't get it or even didn't agree. So how does this impact our team, and what can we do about it? For example, when we are explaining something and we ask if everyone understood, we shouldn't assume everyone did just because no one said otherwise. One way is to rephrase the question. For example, instead of asking, "Is everything clear?" we could say, "What part should I explain some more?" Another way is to let our team explain the things to us, or have them break up in pairs and explain things to each other. It's the same with questions. Don't ask if there are questions, but who has the first question. Because of our tendency to conform, meetings are probably the worst setting to come up with new ideas or to ask for feedback on something. If we need to buy-in from our team, asking if everyone agrees on whatever we want them to agree will most likely backfire, as people will pretend to agree and could display a passive-aggressive attitude towards the project once it started. Again, we shouldn't assume we've got everyone on board just because no one spoke up. In this case, trust, as discussed before, is very important. It's vital our team members feel it is safe for them to speak up. If they speak their mind and later on get in trouble for doing so, it's a sure remedy against openness and transparency. Second, we should play both on group level and on an individual level. If we need to buy-in from our team on an important project, it is wise to informally check with them on a one-on-one basis as to create goodwill for the project and tackle objections individually. Later comes a group presentation with no surprises and a public display of support for the project. Now, when it comes to creativity or brainstorming, it is way more efficient to ask everyone to prepare. Before the meeting by writing down ideas, let's say a minimum of 5 of them, and later discuss them in a group. In any situation, in order to avoid groupthink, it is a good exercise to ask everyone to write their ideas down before launching the actual discussion. Overall, we see that in organizations with dominant managers, Paleolympic managers as we called them before, who use fear and intimidation, conformity will be a real plague. The same is true for environments in restructuring, where people are losing their jobs. Because when faced with a perceived danger, remember, our reptilian brain takes over, and that means we can only flee, fight or freeze. When we flee, we just want to get out of the meeting. When we freeze, we'll just conform with everything. And when we fight, due to the conformity effect, we'll enter guerrilla mode and start acting in a passive-aggressive way. So what these conformity experiments learn us is that being a social animal, even if it gave us an evolutionary advantage, well, that comes with a cost. We should not assume we're all on the same page and the group can be a creativity killer. So our job as leader becomes one where we constantly need to walk the tightrope between the individual and the group, knowing when to choose for one over the other, or combining both. Authority. Remember what I said about authority versus leadership? Well, then you know I'm not really a fan of authority. Still, it is used all over the world in all kinds of settings for some individuals to impose their will on others. And you know what? It works. It does, at least in the short term and at first sight. Remember what we saw in the beginning of this course in the genetic programming. One of the most, if not the most important program running in our subconsciousness is the one to avoid danger. When someone tells us to do something and we know there will be consequences if we don't, we get a very strong urge to comply, and most do. It keeps us out of trouble. It's the modern day equivalent of avoiding danger. But on top of that genetic programming, we have a second subconscious program telling us, screaming at us, not to engage the authority figure. And this one comes from our childhood. You see, as a toddler at first, a child and later a teenager, we're surrounded by authority figures all the time. First our parents, grandparents, other adults in the family. We get our first no at a very young age, followed by timeouts and in some families a slap on the hand or spanking. Sometimes even worse. Where I come from, there's a saying that goes, "He who doesn't want to listen has to feel," meaning if you don't obey, expect a physical punishment. At school, starting from kindergarten, there's a teacher who embodies that authority. We learn to respect the school principal, the police, the doctor, and so on. Basically, when we grow up, we're surrounded by people telling us how to live our life. Now, I'm not saying that that is a good or a bad thing. It's just an observation. It's the way it is. So we're really conditioned to follow rules, to obey authority figures. And we shouldn't be surprised that, even with adults, using authority to impose an idea or to get people to comply, well, it works. Now, before you all start using authority arguments with your teams to get things done, let me share with you a couple of studies and their conclusions when it comes to authority. In Milgram's infamous authority experiment, which took place in the 60s, participants were asked to give an electric shock to another participant if the latter gave a wrong answer to a question. Just to be clear, there were no actual electric shocks given, but the person giving them wasn't aware of that. So there were 30 switches on the voltage generator marked from 15 volts to 450 volts. I won't go into details, but the point is that just because some guy in a white blouse told people to give life-threatening electroshocks to others, well, they just do.
180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
When the participant refused to administer a shock, he or she was told to continue by the experimenter. Shockingly, it was found that close to 65% of them continued till they reached 450 volts. That's a lethal charge, by the way. In later follow-up studies in the Netherlands and Spain, by tweaking some variables, up to 90% went all the way. That's 9 out of 10. In other words, you and I would have most probably done the same. Stanford Prison Experiment. In this highly controversial study led by Zimbardo in 1971, students from the University of Stanford were recruited to take part in a 2-week prison simulation. Of the 24 participants, 12 were assigned the role of the guard and the rest were assigned the role of the prisoner. It was discovered that the guards began psychologically abusing the prisoners without any instruction, and the prisoner, in turn, became depersonalized and submissive, accepting the abuse without protesting in return.
Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing.
In fact, the behavior went to such extremes that the 2-week experiment was completely stopped after only 6 days. 6 days! When they were supposed to be 14. I mean, how much more can an experiment go out of hand?
Gotta go. I to a doctor, anything.
No! No!
God damn it!
The prison experiment underscores the results of the Milgram experiment. Put normal people in an abnormal context and we can make them do almost anything. Exactly the same happens with student hazing or, remember Abu Ghraib? It all comes down to the Stanford Prison Experiment. There are a couple of very interesting conclusions to be drawn from these experiments. The first one is that authority works. People will comply. Almost everyone will, because we are programmed to stay out of trouble. However, that compliance comes with a price. In both experiments, the people complying just turned off their critical thinking, as not to take any responsibility for what was happening. They were just executing what was asked from them. They weren't endorsing their new role, they weren't engaged, they had no sense of ownership, stress levels were sky high, and in both experiments, participants couldn't wait for the experiment to be over. So using authority will work, but it will cost us in everything that makes a team great. Autonomy, responsibility, creativity, proactivity, expect resentment, expect passive aggressiveness, expect high level of employee turnover, as well as sick leave and burnouts. Are you willing to pay that price? So you see, in strong contrast with how leadership is about empowering people, the use of authority does pretty much the opposite. And one final warning. The Stanford experiment showed us how easily we get corrupted by power. At any level, any person should have to be held accountable at any time. When people don't have to explain themselves anymore for what they're doing, it's a recipe for abuse and disaster. When we start using the authority argument instead of explaining our decisions, we're just like that guy in a white blouse telling others to give electroshocks. When we don't allow our team to question our decisions, even to challenge us, we become just like the guards in the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's easier, yes, it's more convenient when people don't ask things that make us uncomfortable. But getting out of our comfort zone will keep us alert. It will keep us in sync with what lives in our team. It will force us to use our prefrontal brain over our paleolimbic brain. And only for that, it should be seen as a blessing and not a curse.
You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part.
It was Ovid, the Roman poet, who wrote about Pygmalion in his Metamorphoses. Pygmalion was a sculptor who ended up falling in love with one of his own creations, a gorgeous ivory statue of a young woman. Long story short, he begs the gods to find someone just like her, and instead the statue comes to life. Anyway, the hero of this story gave his name to one of the most studied psychological effects, the Pygmalion effect, which states that other people will live up to our expectations based on what we think of them. It is called the Pygmalion effect when our positive expectations lead to a positive outcome, and the Golem effect when our negative expectations lead to a negative outcome. I know this claim may sound quite extravagant and exaggerated, namely that how we think about others will influence how they perform. Still, this effect has been observed over and over and over again. I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds of studies applied to parents and teachers in relation to children, and managers, of course, in relation to their team members. In over 80% of the cases, the Pygmalion effect was observed. So it's not about if this one is true or not, it's much more about its ramifications and consequences for us as leaders and managers. It turns out when people are treated by their managers as super people, they try to live up to that image and do what they are expected to do. But when they are treated by the managers as not having any chance of success, this negative expectations also become a managerial self-fulfilling prophecy. The Pygmalion effect really builds upon the Hawthorne experiments, showing us how the role of the different managers influences not only performance, but sometimes a whole career. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Scientific research has revealed the following regarding the Pygmalion effect. What managers expect from their team members and the way they treat them largely determines their performance and career progress. The ability to create high-performance expectations that team members fulfill is a unique characteristic of superior managers. Less effective managers fail to develop similar expectations, and as a consequence, the productivity of their team members suffers. Team members appear to do what they believe they are expected to do. Great, so we just need to tell our people to do well, and that we know they can do it, and then they'll do it. Not so fast. First, You gotta mean it. Seriously. We cannot hide our true feelings from our team by pretending they are great. When we feel deep inside they are not, if we believe someone will perform poorly, it is virtually impossible to mask these expectations because we end up communicating unintentionally without being aware of it. Actually, we are communicating most when we believe we are communicating least. For instance, not saying a thing is being interpreted by our team members as if we are displeased. What seems to be critical in the communication of expectations is not what we say so much as the way we behave. Indifferent and non-committal treatment communicates low expectations and leads to poor performance. Second, expectations must be realistic. I already talked about this before and I want to stress it again in this context. Some managers erroneously believe that we can get better results from our teams by doubling or tripling the objectives. You know, aim high. And that's actually doing more harm than good. Here's why. High expectations must pass the test of reality before they can be translated into performance. Our team members will not be motivated to reach high levels of productivity unless they consider our high expectations realistic and achievable. If not, they will eventually give up trying and settle for results that are lower than what they are capable of. Research by David McClellan of Harvard and John Atkinson of the University of Michigan has shown that the relationship of motivation to expectancy follows a bell-shaped curve. Low expectancy, low motivation. This rises until the expectancy of success reaches 50%, after which it falls again. Yep, that's right. When things become too easy, people won't be motivated anymore. So whatever happens, avoid too easy and too difficult. 3. Remember how I said that the way we see things says more about ourselves than about those things? Well, that's also true about our expectations about our people. Turns out that our expectations of our team members are also partially linked to what we as managers and leaders think of ourselves, about our ability to select, train and motivate our team members. So if we have confidence in our own ability to develop and stimulate our team to high levels of performance, we will expect much of them and treat them with confidence that our expectations will be met. But if we have doubts about our own abilities, that will reflect in how we expect less of them and treat them with less confidence. One more finding is that managerial expectations have the strongest influence on young people. The more experience one has, the more that experience becomes a factor in influencing our behavior, and thus the less our environment, such as our boss, influences that. This has huge implications for new recruits. You see, the early years in an organization turn out to be critical in determining future performance and career progress. A young person's first manager is likely to be one of the most influential in that person's career. Failing to set healthy expectations and motivate young people might have a lasting negative impact on them. Hence the need to have initial bosses of new hires to be the best in the organization. Unfortunately, most companies practice quite the opposite. Newbies end up doing the job no one else wants to do and have to suck it up. It's enough to listen how people and managers complain about millennials to realize this is a problem. Not the millennials' behavior is the problem. It's how we perceive them and evaluate their potential, or lack thereof, which is. So to conclude the Pygmalion effect, you could say that beauty, or in this case talent, lies in the eyes of the beholder. We should hire the right people right from the start, having high but realistic expectations from them. We should communicate those high expectations repeatedly, making sure our people know we believe in them. We should continuously adapt the goals as to keep them challenging enough. And we should continuously develop our own skills when it comes to training and coaching our people. So yes, putting people in high potential programs is good. However, don't forget that might affect negatively the performance of those who aren't in that program. In a perfect world, everyone should be part of the high potential program. So we've arrived at the end of the third and last subconscious influencer. We've seen how our social environment, the people around us, have a profound and lasting influence on what we do. To do so, we went back in time and went over some of the most influential studies, experiments and insights that have helped us gain a better understanding on this matter. The Hawthorne experiments back in the 1920s barely scraped the surface. Still, it was enough to understand we are all social beings, and how we behave is connected to how the people around us behave, being it our boss or our colleague. With the conformity experiments in the 1950s, we saw how more people not always generate more ideas, and how more authority leads to more conformity. Now, talking about authority, it's in the 60s and 70s that the Milgram experiment and the Stanford prison experiment showed us the limitations of using authority to get things done, and even though it may work in the short term, it tends to backfire in a nasty way. And finally, we wrapped things up by looking at the Pygmalion effect, how the way we look at our team and what we expect from them will greatly influence their performance. This all leads to one thing, or more rightly, one person, you. We as leaders bear a responsibility in the success of our team that can hardly be overestimated. We have the power to make or break projects, departments, even careers. First, we need to be aware of that, acknowledge that power. Then we need to act accordingly. Too many managers still see their team as a tool for them to get up the ladder, to advance in their career. The team is there to fulfill their own agenda, their own ambition. Yet what science and this course is trying to demonstrate is that it should be exactly the contrary. We are there to help others up the ladder, to grow, to develop their skills, their competences, and it is only through their success that we can be successful. Let me go even further with that. If they fail, it's because we have failed them. The context, the social context we're in, and our role as a leader cannot be overestimated. Let's take full responsibility for that. And still, if their success is our success, in the end, it's not about us. It's about our team.